The tranquil enclave of OJ Estates was designed as a haven for those yearning for peace, stability, and a tight-knit community, with the homeowners association tasked with maintaining order and harmony. Yet, over the years, this noble purpose had warped into something far darker under the iron rule of Brenda Wilkinson, the HOA president who saw herself as nothing less than a sovereign ruler. Armed with her ever-present clipboard, a hawk-like gaze, and a network of eager informants, Brenda enforced her decrees with ruthless precision. From dictating the exact height of lawns to mandating the precise hue of front doors, no detail was too trivial for her scrutiny. Defiance was met with swift retribution. Fines, stern reprimands, or, in egregious cases, public humiliation via the community newsletter, a tool she wielded like a scepter to keep residents in line. Into this oppressive regime stepped Daniel Harrison, a reserved man in his early 60s who arrived at OJ Estates after a distinguished career in law, seeking nothing more than a quiet retirement. He settled into a modest yet tasteful home on Willow Lane, tending his garden with care and offering neighbors a courteous nod, unassuming, polite, and utterly indifferent to Brenda's self-aggrandizing authority. This indifference sparked an immediate loathing in Brenda. Daniel didn't grovel at her introductions, didn't partake in the HOA's petty gossip, and most gallingly, didn't seek her approval for minor, reasonable alterations to his property. To Brenda, this was an affront to her reign, a crack in the facade of her absolute control that she could not tolerate. Their first clash erupted on a crisp Saturday morning when Brenda, clipboard in hand, stormed up to Daniel's doorstep with a theatrical flourish. "Excuse me, sir," she snapped, her voice cutting through the stillness. "This mailbox isn't in compliance with HOA standards." Daniel, unruffled, glanced at the sturdy, neutral-toned mailbox and asked calmly, "What seems to be the issue?" Brenda jabbed a finger at her notes, declaring it the wrong shade of brown, as though the discrepancy were a capital offense. Daniel, ever composed, pointed out that the color matched the guidelines perfectly, but Brenda bristled, unused to resistance. "I make the final decisions on compliance," she huffed, her authority a flimsy shield against his quiet defiance. Daniel's response was a measured blow. He cited the HOA charter, noting that presidents lacked unilateral power. Rules required board votes, not her whims. Brenda's face flushed with fury, her carefully constructed dominion challenged by this newcomer's logic. From that moment, Daniel became her nemesis, and she unleashed a torrent of violation notices. His grass was a half-inch too tall, his garden hose unsightly, his car parked slightly askew. Each time, Daniel countered with polite, precise rebuttals, dismantling her accusations with legal acumen that only deepened her rage. Determined to break him, Brenda called a special HOA meeting, framing Daniel as a rogue threat to OJ Estate's order, her loyal board nodding in sycophantic agreement as she prepared to tighten her grip. The special HOA meeting was Brenda Wilkinson's grand stage, a chance to crush Daniel Harrison and reassert her dominance over OJ Estates. Flanked by her loyal board, her personal echo chamber, she launched into a melodramatic tirade, painting Daniel as a lawless renegade who threatened the neighborhood's very foundation. "We must set an example," she declared, her voice trembling with theatrical indignation as she glared at him, "or this community will crumble." Daniel sat calmly in the audience, dressed in a simple button-up shirt and slacks, his serene demeanor a stark contrast to Brenda's histrionics. When she finished, he rose, his voice cutting through the tension like a blade. "Madame President, may I ask a few questions?" Brenda smirked, expecting to humiliate him, but Daniel's next move was a masterstroke. Producing the HOA charter, a document she'd long treated as her personal playbook, he read aloud a passage requiring board votes for enforcement actions. "I see no record of votes for my fines," he said, his tone even but unyielding, "which makes them illegal." The room fell silent, Brenda's smugness evaporating as he continued, dismantling her newly minted rules as void without homeowner input. Her board shifted uncomfortably, whispers rippling through the crowd as neighbors began to see the cracks in her tyranny. For the first time in years, Brenda's control slipped, and she stormed out, humiliated but seething with a newfound resolve. That night, alone in her pristine home, Brenda nursed a glass of cheap wine, her fury simmering as she scoured the HOA guidelines for a weapon against Daniel. The sting of public disgrace fueled a reckless plan. If she couldn't defeat him with rules, she'd twist them until they broke. Summoning her inner circle of enforcers, power-hungry lackeys like Marge, who thrived on petty control, she declared, "We need to get rid of this man. He's a menace to our authority." Marge, clutching her pearls, gasped, "The way he spoke to you was disgraceful." Brenda nodded, playing the victim with practiced ease, though what they'd built was less a community and more a racket of fines and fear. Over the next week, Brenda unleashed a barrage of harassment. Daniel's fence was suddenly too high, his security cameras unauthorized, his lights a nuisance. Each time he responded with infuriating calm, citing bylaws and evidence that left her accusations in tatters. "He's mocking me," she fumed, hurling one of his letters across her desk. Marge leaned in, whispering, "If rules won't work, maybe the real authorities will." Brenda's lips curled into a sinister grin. The next day, she dialed 911, her voice dripping with faux concern. "There's an illegal, dangerous structure in our neighborhood, a massive gazebo that could collapse." She embellished wildly, claiming it endangered children, her desperation cloaked in civic duty. Within 30 minutes, a patrol car arrived at Daniel's house, and Brenda watched gleefully from her window, certain she'd finally won. As the police cruiser rolled up to Daniel Harrison's home, Brenda Wilkinson peered through her blinds, her heart pounding with vindictive glee. She was certain this would be the moment her nemesis fell. Daniel answered the door, unruffled as ever, his calm radiating an almost eerie confidence as the officer relayed Brenda's wild tale of a dangerous gazebo. With a faint flicker of amusement in his eyes, Daniel invited the officer to the backyard, where Brenda's breath hitched in anticipation of his downfall. But then the unthinkable happened. The officer laughed. "Sir," he chuckled, shaking his head, "this gazebo is perfectly legal and better built than mine." Daniel offered to show permits, but the officer waved him off, apologizing for the bother before driving away. Brenda's triumph turned to ash as Daniel, spotting her lurking, gave a polite, knowing wave, a gesture that twisted the knife of her humiliation deeper. Enraged, she slammed the blinds shut, snarling, "This isn't over." That night, she summoned her board for an emergency meeting, packing like a caged beast. "He's dangerous," she hissed, "manipulative, we must stop him." Carl, a timid board member, ventured, "But he hasn't done anything wrong." Brenda whirled on him, her eyes blazing. "Are you with me or him?" she spat, silencing his caution as Marge suggested digging for dirt on Daniel. "Perfect," Brenda growled, her obsession now a full-blown vendetta. Days later, an unmarked envelope arrived in Brenda's mailbox, its contents chilling her to the core. "Mrs. Wilkinson, weaponizing the law bites back. Cease your actions, or this escalates. Some of us know how to make it work against abusers. This is your only warning." Her hands trembled as she read, the blood draining from her face. How had it been delivered unseen? Her security footage showed nothing, amplifying her paranoia. Yet instead of heeding the warning, her pride fueled a defiant doubling down. "You want war, Judge Carter," she muttered, crumpling the letter. "You've got one." Recklessly, Brenda crossed into outright illegality, ordering an emergency inspection of Daniel's property while he was away. 2 HOA workers, visibly uneasy, hopped his fence, snapping photos and rifling through his yard, even peering into his garage. They left smug, believing they'd secured damning evidence for Brenda's crusade. Unbeknownst to them, Daniel's hidden cameras captured every move in crisp detail. Watching the feed live on his phone, a cold smile spread across his face as he zoomed in on their faces. "That's breaking and entering, Brenda," he murmured, his voice a quiet storm. "Time you learned what happens when you mess with the law." Brenda, oblivious in her plush office, gloated over the photos. A shed and a classic car she wrongly deemed violations, convinced she'd finally won, unaware she'd just lit the fuse to her own destruction. Brenda Wilkinson sat smugly in her plush office chair, scrolling through the illicit photos her maintenance team had snapped of Daniel Harrison's property, her eyes gleaming with triumph. She was certain she'd finally cornered him. "An unauthorized structure," she muttered, zooming in on a perfectly legal shed, "and an unregistered vehicle." The classic car in his garage, covered and lawful, was no violation, but facts no longer mattered to Brenda. Only victory did. She grabbed her phone, dialing the HOA attorney with imperious zeal. "We need to file a lawsuit," she barked. "He's in gross violation." A weary sigh crackled through the line. "Brenda," the lawyer groaned. You can't keep targeting him without a case. It's a waste of funds. Her facade cracked, rage seeping through as she snapped. I have evidence. She forwarded the photos, defiance in every click. A heavy silence followed, then the lawyer's voice turned icy. How did you get these? HOA inspection, she replied, too quick, too casual. Without consent, he pressed. Brenda scoffed. We have the right to inspect. It's a technicality. His tone darkened. No, Brenda, it's breaking and entering. If Carter finds out, he could press charges. Doubt flickered in her mind, a cold premonition of consequences, but her arrogance snuffed it out. She hung up, drafting a lawsuit claiming Daniel owed thousands in fabricated fines, blind to the catastrophic error she'd just made. The next morning, Daniel sipped coffee on his porch, savoring the quiet, when a process server handed him Brenda's lawsuit. He skimmed the absurd accusations, a soft chuckle escaping him, amused yet edged with steel. You shouldn't have done that, Brenda, he murmured, shaking his head. Inside, he crafted not just a defense but a counterclaim, lethal in its precision. That evening, Brenda gathered her board, tossing the lawsuit onto the table with a flourish. I've handled it, she boasted. Carter will either go bankrupt or leave in disgrace. We win. She expected praise. Instead, silence greeted her. Marge, pale, slid her phone across the table. Have you seen the news? Brenda's eyes widened at the headline. HOA president sued for harassment, trespassing, and abuse of power. Federal judge files complaint. Her breath hitched, hands shaking as she read. Daniel Carter, retired federal judge, 30 years on the bench. The room spun. Her phone rang. Detective Morgan from OJ Police. We need you at the station regarding a trespassing complaint. We have footage of your illegal entry order. Cooperate. The line went dead, her board staring in horror as Marge whispered, You messed with the wrong person, Brenda. Her world teetered on the brink, her hubris now her noose. Brenda Wilkinson sat in a stark courtroom 2 days later, her hands clenched so tightly her knuckles gleamed white, the air thick with tension as the judge called her case. She stole a glance at Daniel Harrison, seated calmly in the gallery, a faint, unreadable smile on his lips, his presence a silent rebuke to her crumbling empire. The judge, stern and unyielding, fixed her with a piercing gaze. Mrs. Wilkinson, he began, his voice a low rumble of authority, you've used the HOA as a personal weapon to harass a homeowner. He paused, letting the weight settle, then continued. Evidence shows you authorized an unlawful entry onto private property, criminal actions, especially egregious given your target is a retired federal judge. Brenda opened her mouth, a feeble excuse forming, but the judge cut her off with a sharp, Be quiet, Mrs. Wilkinson. She flinched, the reprimand a physical blow. You have 2 choices, he declared, flipping through files with deliberate precision. Plead guilty to harassment, trespassing, and abuse of authority, accepting the penalties, or face a trial where the consequences will be far worse. Her heart hammered. A trial against a federal judge. She'd lost utterly. I plead guilty, Your Honor, she whispered, voice breaking. Daniel's smile widened slightly, a quiet triumph as the judge nodded curtly. By week's end, Brenda was stripped of her HOA presidency, fined thousands, and ordered to pay damages to Daniel and other victims of her reign. The HOA board, desperate to distance themselves, voted to dissolve the association entirely, dismantling the structure Brenda had twisted into her personal fiefdom. Her reputation, once a fortress of fear, lay in ruins, her name a punchline in OJ Estates. She sat alone in her dim living room, clutching a glass of cheap wine, the silence oppressive as shame gnawed at her. Laughter drifted from outside. Peering through the blinds, she saw neighbors, Daniel among them, chatting freely, their ease a dagger to her pride. They were celebrating her downfall, and she, once the neighborhood's queen, was now an outcast, irrelevant, erased from their world. Her past tyrannies resurfaced like vengeful ghosts. Mr. Thompson's $500 fine for a garden gnome, the Johnsons' deaf dog nearly banished, Mrs. Lopez forced to repaint her house thrice in a year, all petty cruelties now public. Online, her disgrace exploded, Reddit threads, news reports, a viral video titled, HOA Karen calls cops on judge, ends up in court, racked up millions of views, each comment a lash of mockery. Imagine losing to a federal judge after years of HOA tyranny, one read. Overwhelmed, Brenda deleted her social media, but the damage was done. Her name, once a cudgel of control, was now synonymous with infamy, her power stripped bare. Brenda Wilkinson's world continued to unravel as a certified letter arrived, its official heft a harbinger of doom in her trembling hands. She assumed it was another fine, but the truth was far worse. It was a civil lawsuit, not just from Daniel Harrison but from 6 other homeowners, united in their fury over years of her abuses, unlawful fines, relentless harassment, emotional distress, and the bombshell, illegal use of HOA funds for personal gain. Her head spun, the legal terms blurring into a menacing fog. Her bank account, already bled dry by prior penalties, couldn't withstand this. If she lost, bankruptcy loomed, an abyss she'd dug herself. In desperation, she called her old HOA attorney, voice cracking, "I need help." A weary sigh answered, then a cold rebuke. "I warned you, Brenda, you're on your own." The line went dead, leaving her utterly abandoned. The homeowner's lawsuit was a landslide victory, the court ordering Brenda to repay thousands in ill-gotten fines and damages, a sum she couldn't possibly cover. With no funds left, she was forced to sell her house, the epicenter of her former empire, now a monument to her ruin. Worse, no one in OJ Estates would touch it. Her reign had scorched too many bridges. The house sold far below market value, a fire sale that deepened her financial devastation, mirroring the wreckage of her social standing. Brenda vanished from the neighborhood, her whereabouts fodder for gossip. Some said she'd slunk into a cramped apartment in a seedy part of town, others that she'd taken a menial retail job just to survive, rumors painting a portrait of her pathetic descent. One day, Daniel Harrison, now savoring his tranquil retirement, strolled into a local department store, browsing bookshelves when a familiar voice chirped, "Would you like to sign up for our rewards program?" He turned to see Brenda behind the counter, clad in a garish red uniform, her eyes widening in horror as recognition dawned. Her forced cheer dissolved into raw shame, their gazes locking in a moment of poetic justice. Daniel offered a polite, knowing smile, not cruel, not smug, just an acknowledgement of fate's full circle. "No, thank you," he said gently, walking away, leaving her frozen, the weight of her new reality crashing down. Brenda, once OJ Estates' tyrant, was now a faceless cashier, stripped of all power, her petty empire reduced to ringing up sales under a manager rumored to be as strict and rule-obsessed as she'd once been, a karmic mirror of her own tyranny. Her punishment was complete, not just legal defeat, but social, financial, and emotional obliteration. The story of her fall spread, a cautionary tale of hubris and justice, amplified by neighbors' tales of her past cruelties and the internet's unrelenting scorn, ensuring her name lived on, not as a symbol of control, but as a warning of what happens when power corrupts unchecked. Brenda Wilkinson's descent was a spectacle of karmic precision, her once-iron grip on OJ Estates reduced to a fading echo as the neighborhood reclaimed its peace. The civil lawsuit had stripped her of her home and wealth, leaving her a pariah in a community she'd ruled through fear, her financial ruin a mirror to the emotional desolation that now defined her. The house she'd once lorded over sold to outsiders at a pittance, its new owners oblivious to the petty empire it once anchored, while Brenda slipped into obscurity, her name whispered only in tales of her downfall. The HOA, that brittle scaffold of her tyranny, was gone, dissolved by a board scrambling to escape her taint, leaving OJ Estates free of her shadow for the first time in years. Daniel Harrison, the quiet catalyst of her undoing, settled into the retirement he'd sought, his days marked by simple pleasures, coffee on his porch, a well-tended garden, and the occasional nod to neighbors no longer cowed by HOA edicts. His victory wasn't loud or boastful. It didn't need to be. The law, wielded with the steady hand of a retired federal judge, had done its work, dismantling Brenda's reign with a precision she could neither fathom nor counter. When their paths crossed in that department store, his polite smile had been the final punctuation, a gentle reminder that justice, not vengeance, had prevailed, leaving her to stew in the wreckage of her choices. Brenda's new life was a stark contrast to her past grandeur. A cashier in a fluorescent-lit purgatory, her uniform a badge of her fall, her days dictated by a manager whose petty rules echoed her own former cruelties. The irony wasn't lost on those who heard the rumors, her powerlessness now a daily penance, her voice reduced to scripted pleasantries for strangers who neither knew nor cared about her past. Online, her story lived on, a viral morality play, Reddit threads dissected her tyranny, YouTube comments reveled in her humiliation, and news outlets framed her as the archetype of HOA excess. A Karen, undone by her own hubris, her shame a public feast for millions. The neighborhood, too, found its voice in her absence. Emboldened by her fall, residents shared their own scars, fines for trivialities, threats over harmless quirks, each tale a brick in the monument of her disgrace. Mr. Thompson's gnome, the Johnsons' deaf dog, Mrs. Lopez's bright paint. These weren't just grievances, but testaments to a reign that had stifled joy under the guise of order. Brenda's punishment, legal, social, and self-inflicted, was deemed enough by many, a fitting end to a tyrant who'd mistaken control for strength. Yet, as her name faded into a cautionary whisper, OJ Estates thrived, proving that true community endures not through fear, but through the quiet resilience of those who stand against it. The saga of Brenda Wilkinson closed with a quiet inevitability, her once dominant presence in OJ Estates erased by the very forces she'd sought to command: law, community, and karma itself. Her fall was total. Stripped of her HOA throne, her home sold at a loss, her reputation shredded by court rulings and online infamy, she became a ghost of her former self, haunting the edges of a neighborhood that no longer trembled at her name. The civil lawsuit's crushing financial blow forced her into a life of anonymity, a cramped apartment or a retail counter, depending on the rumors. Where she wielded no power, her days a monotonous echo of the control she'd once craved. OJ Estates, liberated from her grip, blossomed into the sanctuary it was meant to be, its residents savoring a freedom untainted by her petty decrees. Daniel Harrison, the unassuming judge who toppled her empire, remained a fixture of understated triumph. His mornings on the porch, coffee in hand, were a testament to the peace he'd fought for, not with fanfare, but with the steady, impartial might of the law he'd spent decades upholding. That final encounter in the store, where Brenda's shame met his gentle refusal, encapsulated their story. No gloating, no cruelty, just a nod to justice served. His victory wasn't personal. It was principled, a reminder that true power lies in integrity, not intimidation. As Brenda faded, Daniel endured, a quiet symbol of resilience against tyranny, his presence a subtle assurance that some battles are won through patience and truth. The broader world seized Brenda's tale with relish, turning her into a cautionary icon, an HOA Karen whose hubris invited her ruin. Viral videos and scathing comments immortalized her fall, each click a nail in the coffin of her pride, while neighbors' stories of her past abuses fueled a collective catharsis. Her punishment, bankruptcy, isolation, a criminal record, felt poetic to many, a fitting end to a reign built on sand. Yet her story transcended mere retribution. It was a lesson in the fragility of unchecked authority and the strength of unity. The dissolution of the HOA wasn't just Brenda's defeat. It was a rejection of the system she'd warped, a reclaiming of community over control. What lingered was the moral. Power rooted in fear and pettiness is fleeting, while respect, fairness, and empathy endure. Brenda's obsession with dominance left her with nothing, socially, financially, emotionally bankrupt, while OJ Estates thrived without her. Her fate sparked debates. Was her punishment enough? For some, her public shamming and loss were justice enough. For others, her quiet suffering under a petty manager mirrored her own tyranny too perfectly to be coincidence. Whatever the verdict, her story stood as a potent reminder. Those who abuse the law, who trample others for control, inevitably face its impartial reckoning. In the end, Brenda learned, the hard, humiliating way, that power trips don't pay, leaving OJ Estates to heal, and Daniel to enjoy the peace he'd quietly ensured.